welcome to the special COVID-19 diary series interviews where we discuss matters pertaining to infectious diseases prompting up all over the world, and also how we can also get the right infodemics out there to help science journalists get the right information for you. And this episode especially sits with two scientists to discuss the origins of immunization in African culture and traditional medicine. And you'll bear with me that the persistence and periodic resurgence of infectious diseases all over the world isn't stopping from now. You know, recently was COVID-19, the hen virus, and now monkeypox, and a whole lot. And these was what makes it necessary for us to discuss how it all started. Where is the origin of immunization in the first place? And has African culture and traditional medicine got a role to play for the foundation of immunization? Your guess is as good as mine, but let's try and then straighten these thoughts with the experts right now. And I invite Dr. Eluemuno Blyden, who is the CEO of Avril Biopharma, and also Dr. Ikechukwu Achebe, an inaugural IAFS District Visited Scholar at the Elliot School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Nice people, you're welcome to COVID-19 Diary Special Interview Series.
Thank you very much.
Glad. So let's go straight to the point with the foundation. Has African culture and traditional medicine got a role to play in immunization? That's the million-dollar question.
I'm a scientist by profession, but of course I come from a background of a historical family, so I've always been interested in the origins of some of the scientists that I've done in the lab. And in the course of that, I have stumbled on the very interesting history of how immunology and ideas of immunity on which immunology is based emerged from African traditional medicine. And I was lucky enough to be introduced to Dr. Ikechukwu Achebe, and that started a conversation which evolved and became so interesting that I thought it was important for us to bring it to the public. And the aautv's invitation to me seemed like a very good opportunity for that. So here I am. And first and foremost, I would like to ask Dr. Achebe to introduce himself and say a little bit about his background.
Splendid.
Thank you very much, moderator. I am particularly delighted to be in the company of Dr. Eluemuno Blyden from the very distinguished Blyden intellectual political family, a family that has made tremendous contributions to the intellectual, mental, economic liberation of the continent. I was particularly thrilled to receive an invitation from Dr. Blyden to join him in a series of discussions about the origins of immunity. It's work that I began quite a while ago. It's now nearly 25 years. In fact, a quarter of a century, to put it in stark terms. My background, I'm a historian by training. I obtained my research degree in history at Trinity College in Cambridge many years ago. That's the context in which I began looking into questions about immunity at a time, as you can understand, well before COVID and the crisis that we find ourselves in today. And at that time, the summary of what I found was that inoculation as a practice was introduced to America in 1721.
Okay.
And last year, being 2021, made it the tricentenary of the introduction of inoculation to America.
Mm.
And inoculation was introduced to America by Africans who were enslaved. So enslaved Africans who were brought to Boston in the years before 1721, and who found themselves in the midst of an outbreak of smallpox in Boston, at a time when much of, well, practically all of the West didn't have any tools whatsoever to understand or to treat smallpox. And so that was a sort of context. And my background in history led me to do the research and come out with a small book on that history.
Great.
Would you like me to say more? Eluemuno, please go ahead.
Well, that was a very good introduction and a very good summary of the historical arc that I discovered by accident. And to find that Dr. Ikechukwu had actually, Dr. Achebe had actually laid out the documentary trail much deeper into the African tradition and African context was very exciting for me. Interestingly enough, you can find this history about how Africans brought the ideas of immunization and immunity and the practice, not just the ideas and the practice of smallpox immunization. You can find all of that on the website of the National Library of Medicine of the United States. It's online, nlm.us.gov or nlm.gov. And you can actually read the original documents, mostly documents about the discussion amongst intellectuals in Boston, people of the ilk of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was actually the publisher who published a lot of these pamphlets, the doctors. And remember, at that time, there was no United States. We're really talking about a British colony in America. Okay, so that's also an important thing to remember. But the long and short of that was that when you read those documents, as you find a lot of discussions about, first of all, the fact that this was an incredibly valuable scientific insight that was now entering the sphere of Western thought or European medicine. But that was juxtaposed against the incredulity that this could have possibly come from Africa. They literally struggled with the idea that God would have, as they put it, that God would have told this to Africans and not told it to them. That's what it really boiled down to. And of course, that also came with a significant amount of sort of xenophobia, if you like, of the concept itself. Because what did it say? It said we can take a disease, somebody suffering from smallpox, we can take some of that pus that they're suffering from, and we can, process it, dry it in the sun, whatever, and then we can put it on somebody else, and the other person will become resistant to that disease. That's a very fundamental idea of immunology. And it's also one that is very difficult to grasp. Both as a scientist, it's hard to grasp, but also as a layperson, it's difficult to grasp, to fit it into your cultural context, your religious beliefs, whatever. And we've seen that amply played out in this pandemic, of course, even today. The back and forth, the debates about whether vaccines are safe or not, all of that kind of thing. It has a lot of historical precedent going back to that time.
Mr. Blyden, so, I just did a quick search into normal contemporary day history, and a name like Edward Jenner, who was a country doctor living in Berkeley, in England in 1796, performed the world's first vaccination. That's what it says right here. Who took from a cowpox lesson on a milkmaid's hand. Jenner inoculated an 80-year-old boy, James Phillips. So you have this information sitting online that makes a point that in 1796 there was a first immunization by one in English, Edward Jenner, trying to just take the whole claim that it was from the Western world that immunization came, opposing the African culture and traditional medicine and as a foundation for immunization. What is the counter claim to this?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm not making a counter claim, but there's a consistent thing to the history when you read the history that you'll find, which is that the use of words, the use of terminology is often used to obscure the real attribution for anything that's of significance or importance. In other words, it gets hijacked. We are talking about, there's clear documentary evidence that the concept of immunization, the practice of immunization, existed centuries before the birth of Jenner. Okay, now if you start talking to someone in the English language, they'll say, well, oh no, we're talking about vaccination. We're not talking about variolation or inoculation. There are all these different, subtle differences about the practice. And there's genuine scientific basis for those variations, yes. But the fundamental concept of immunity is what we're really talking about. And that, because that is the actual intellectual property, that is the foundation of all whichever variations of the practice anybody came up with in subsequent years after it had been, described to them by Africans. So the reality is that Jenner was not the first European to discover the smallpox immunization. Neither was Cotton Mather. Even the people in Boston, they were not the first Europeans either. The first Europeans, in fact, to discover immunization and to use it were the captains of slave ships, because they used to actually send captives back on shore to be immunized according to this native juju medicine practice. However, we were taught to see it as something foreign and alien. But the slave ship captains, they were clever enough to recognize that would protect their cargoes in crossing the Atlantic. So you have to ask yourself the question, how come in the middle of smallpox epidemics, these slave captains were able to pack ships? We've all seen those diagrams. They were able to pack people in ships so much so that they couldn't even move, like sardines. Why didn't they all die of smallpox? That's the question you have to ask. Why didn't they die of smallpox? How were they able to bring even one person across without killing everybody else on board the ship? It's a 3-week passage. Why? Very simple. It turns out that in West Africa, during that time, where they were bringing those captives from, they were immunized against smallpox as a general practice. And that is where I think, Ikechukwu, you need to come in and really explain what was happening in Africa.
Absolutely.
Where they were getting these people from and how that dovetailed with what happened in the New World.
Yeah, so Dr. Ikechukwu, let me put it to you this way, that where and when was it discovered in Africa that they had the control over immunization? Where and when in Africa?
Okay, thank you very much. The research that I've done was centered around the time when inoculation and the idea of immunity was introduced to America, and from America to London, to England. And what those Africans who were enslaved and brought to Boston said about where they learned the practice. It was those Africans in Boston who taught two men, among others, but the sort of leading proponents of inoculation in Boston were somebody called Cotton Mather, who was a distinguished Puritan minister in a church. He was from, a fairly distinguished family. His father had been president of Harvard. He had been, voted to be president. That was overruled. He spent a lot of time developing Yale, as an important center. And his friend, a man called Zabdiel Boylston, who actually carried out the trials by inoculating about 246 individuals in Boston. They learned the technique from the Africans who were enslaved in Boston, who taught them how that practice had been executed in their homes in Africa. And they explained the steps that were taken. It was that explanation that both Cotton Mather and Zabdiel Boylston implemented and began for the first time in the history of American medicine, trials in inoculating patients who were infected with the smallpox. So what the Africans said at the time, and this is what Dr. Blyden was referring to, was that in Africa, the practice was very common.
Okay.
Okay, and remember we're talking about 1721.
Oh.
And there was a particular elder. Now, 1721 is a year in which they began the trials. They had been gathering the information from Africans from about 1716. And the Africans said to them, well, in our country, we do this all the time. We have doctors who do this. And these are the techniques. This is the way it's done. And it appeared that white slave captains who went to acquire slaves on the coast of West Africa also knew that there were doctors, African doctors on shore, who, if you were an unfortunate African sold into slavery and you had not been inoculated, they would send you back on shore to be inoculated. So this was in the late 17th century, before the Boston practice in 1721. So as to dates, the evidence we have from one of the Africans who explained this procedure in Boston was that he imagined the practice was done in his country in West Africa long before he was born. And this was a gentleman of sort of middle age who had been enslaved from West Africa. So the practice was so fundamental in its impact on Western medicine that in fact, it was declared the most significant discovery in medicine for the preservation of human life by the leading Western scientists, one of whom a man called Hans Sloane in England, who was president of the Royal Society. The Royal Society was the great academy of scientists in England and in Europe. Hans Sloane had succeeded Sir Isaac Newton as president of the Royal Society. So these were the people who were engaging with the enslaved West Africans, who taught them the practice of inoculation. But more than that, the idea that you could stimulate the immune system through inoculation. And in West Africa, the evidence is much, much deeper, broader, and greater, that inoculation didn't simply stop at the cutting of the skin and the insertion of variolous matter.
Yeah.
But that it's extended to notions of power, authority, that those who held authority were said to be those who were immune, those who were capable of exercising power, those who would not succumb to attacks. It was a much broader notion of immunity and went beyond, inoculation to ideas of agency and authority. There were a number of smallpox societies in West Africa, in the kingdoms of Dahomey, among the Igbo, among the Yoruba. There were established smallpox societies, and with different names, Sabata, Sapono, and so on. And these practices were really very carefully differentiated. There were smallpox, quote unquote, gods, smallpox, quote unquote, cults. We have to be careful how we use terms, because a lot of it is mediated and full of all sorts of,
indeed,
racist and biases.
I was warning against that earlier, and the word I've settled on is deity. Deity. Yes. That's my word now that I'm using.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Blyden. So these, one has to be extremely careful in reconstructing this history. But the bottom line was that in London in the 1700s, early 1700s, the cures for smallpox were, sachets that were sold and full of tar, black tar. They said if you mixed it with water and drank it, you'd be cured by from smallpox. These were fetishes that were sold, and there was no cure for smallpox in Europe or in America. And West Africans introduced inoculation to Europe and to West Africa and to America in the early 1700s.
Great. One of the very important aspects to what you just said is the means of immunization. I'm so interested in the means. So if Africa had the ideas, we set the pace in immunization, and you mentioned that, at that time we were not having all these needle-like tools to make those vaccinations, or let's say piercings. So how were these carried out? You mentioned that they were through some deity, let me say, black magic power that was able to immunize people. Let's set that clear. How were Africans undertaking immunization? Through which forms? Through the deities or through traditional medicine?
I'd like to say a few words about that, if I may,
Great.
Dr. Achebe. Let me jump in on this one, because I think it's a very important lesson for young scientists in Africa at the moment. And that is to understand and be able to recognize science in the African context.
Great.
So we talk about these deities, and we've heard Dr. Achebe has mentioned the variety of names, Sapata, Sapono, that you find all the way from as far away as Sierra Leone, all the way down to Angola. There are variations on that, which already tells you just how widespread this knowledge was in the Africa context. But the important thing, I want you to imagine the situation. Remember that smallpox, like COVID-19, it's an invisible thing. Okay, it's an invisible thing. It's attacking a culture, cultures that are basically oral. They don't have a written tradition per se. They don't have writing. They're not using it. It's not that whether they have it or not. They have symbols and so forth. But so the challenge is, how do you? Oh, and then third thing to bear in mind is that these epidemics, pandemics, whatever, they come unexpectedly, they go unexpectedly. Okay, when they're done, they disappear. Okay, so you have, how do you pass on the knowledge that, hey, there's this thing, it's invisible. When it comes, it kills you in this way or that way. This is the things you have to do. These are the practices, hygiene practices you have to follow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do you store that information in an oral culture to be able to go from one generation to the next so that people understand it? And smallpox is a very beautiful example of how African culture stored information about very sophisticated and complex scientific or biological or health medical ideas. Sapono, Sapata, Babalo, Aye, these are all various names of this deity. What was the key character of this deity? We have other deities we know of, like Shango, he's the one of metal, Yemaja, she's the lady of the waters, etc., etc., etc. So what was Sapono? What was the character of Sapono? The character of Sapono was that he could both harm you, but he could also heal you.
Yeah.
So here was this character who essentially he embodied the concept of immunology on which all modern medicine is based. You know, SARS-CoV-2, yeah, it can harm you, but if you know how to process it and clone the gene for the spike protein and express it in another organism and deliver it as a vaccine or as a nasal spray or some other way, he can also heal you or protect you or provide immunity against his activity or his danger.
Okay.
So that fundamental concept is actually a scientific idea, but it is codified in a little sculptures, and you can see them if you just Google Sapono, and you'll see you have little figure carving with lots of white dots representing the smallpox, and then the practices that go with that include being sanitary, washing your hands, all of those things. Those are all associated with his practice, which of course, as Dr. Achebe pointed out, the English came and they called it a cult, or they called it a juju or secret society or whatever, and then systematically destroyed those what were basically, they were like libraries of medicine. They were practices of medicine. They were places where young people could learn to be practitioners and go out and obviously spread the practice.
Great. So we're having a great discussion with Dr. Blyden and also Dr. Ikechukwu, all about the origination of immunization in the African culture and traditional medicine. And you would appreciate at this point you understanding where Africa stands, way back in 2021, where we were discovering ways and means to stay immunized against smallpox, with so many means that we had inherent in our culture, but today had been domestified to mean something negative. So just stay with us. We'll talk more on the essence of Africa's stake in traditional medicine and the future of what we stand to gain. So stay with us. We'll be right back. You're welcome back to the special COVID-19 diary series interviews, and we have on today Dr. Blyden and also Dr. Ikechukwu discussing the origin of immunization in African culture and traditional medicine. And at this point, we'll be taking the wrap-ups, and we'll be looking at how we were dispensing our forms of immunization the African way, and also seeing the future of African traditional medicine and the role it plays in providing immunization, vaccination to, imminent diseases that are infectious, like the monkeypox, the hen virus, and all that. So let's start with you, Dr. Blyden, on your feed on the future of Africa in terms of contributing to vaccinations and immunology.
Well, my motivation for inviting a historian, an eminent historian here today to sit beside me as a scientist is that I believe that we cannot move forward successfully into the future without really clarifying the foundation on which we want to build that future for our descendants, our African descendants.
Yeah.
We're in the middle of a time when reparations have become very important. Material artifacts are being returned to the African continent right now in order to galvanize our cultural identity, our political processes, and so forth. And I think that we should not, this smallpox history is a history that is about the return of intellectual property, an intellectual property that is extremely valuable, as we now see in the modern world, since so much of modern medicine is based on immunology.
Dr. Ikechukwu, as an eminent historian and an eminent one, we're glad to also have your word on how Africans were dispensing these immunization modes and the future of Africa in terms of the table contributing to immunization and vaccination.
Yes, thank you again. In relation to the question you asked earlier about what were the methods through which Africans were actually demonstrating and practicing inoculation as far back as the early 1700s. Again, we have documentary evidence from Boston that, and I'll just, try and read from some of the documents just to give you an idea. Okay. On the 13th of December in 1706, Cotton Mather, who was the Puritan minister we mentioned, very prominent Puritan minister in Boston.
All right.
He received from members of his congregation in the church a gift of a West African, an enslaved West African who would work for him.
Okay.
And he gave this West African the name Onesimus from the Bible.
Onesimus,
okay. Yeah. Now, routinely, if you had somebody join your household in Boston, you would want to find out whether they had had the smallpox, because if they hadn't, it meant that they could become infected and maybe infect members of your family. So the first question Cotton Mather asked Onesimus when he was given to him as a gift by his congregation was, have you had the smallpox? And this is what Cotton Mather wrote in his diary. He said this was Onesimus' reply.
That'll be interesting.
He said, quote, inquiring of my Negro man, Onesimus, who's a pretty intelligent fellow, whether he had ever had the smallpox, he answered both yes and no. And then told me that he had undergone an operation which had given him something of the smallpox and would forever preserve him from it, adding that it was often used among his people in West Africa, and whoever had the courage to use it was forever free from the fear of the contagion. He described the operation to me and showed me in his arm the scar which it had left upon him. And so the operation was simply the cutting of the skin, the scarification of the skin, the introduction of the diluted virus matter, the tying of the site of the operation, and the patient would be sick for a few days, would break out in a few pox, and would be well again, and would then be immune. That's what he described. And this is in fact the practice they used.
That's
in West Africa, the practice was much wider. It wasn't just the cutting of the skin. You could inhale it. There were different ways of introducing, of stimulating the immune system.
That's interesting.
And the idea of scarification, which a lot of West Africans used to do, it used to be very, very common, was in fact one way of inoculating children against a range of diseases, much in the same way as you have children who are vaccinated before they go to school today. So when you see those scars and you think they're tribal marks, there was in fact science and medicine behind it. There was one example of the installation of chiefs in West Africa. Again, scarification marks were used. And this was to strengthen the chief, to make him immune and powerful. So these were very widespread practices. Now, as to the future, I've already drawn the analogy with modern vaccination and the way in which children are routinely immunized against a range of diseases today, when they attend school. And so I think that that's the context. West Africans, by the way, this practice transformed medicine from practices in alchemy to what we call modern medicine today. It was essentially inoculation that created the transition from a sort of pre-scientific forms of medicine to modern scientific medicine,
contemporary medicine
in the early modern period.
Great.
That's
a momentous event, and it was introduced to America and later to England by West Africans.
It really was a fundamental juncture. And the thing about that point in time is that if you look at all of the kind of stereotypical roles that we tend to this day, we still have in our minds, it was in fact the Europeans in Boston who were fetishists and were relying on strange treatments involving sachets and cow dung and all of this kind of stuff. And it was the Africans who actually had a scientific basis for what they were doing that simply nobody really understood at that time. And to really make that point, something very interesting about the history, Cotton Mather, just 10 years before Onesimus came into his life, he was one of the judges in the Salem witch trials. I don't know if you've heard of the Salem witch trials, but this was a very well-known event in American history in which a small town called Salem near Boston, they burned witches in medieval times, you know that they were still practicing that. There was a very famous trial where they tried these young ladies because they thought they were crazy, or they were probably had some kind of infection that was causing them to behave strangely. And they persecuted them because they thought they were the devil. They thought they had been possessed. And they actually ended up, killing these innocent young women because they thought they were possessed. They were witches. So you have to juxtapose where the European mind was at that time with this piece of knowledge that today has turned into a multi-trillion-dollar industry.
I think it's very important that we try and then bridge the discussion to a part 2, where we also take it to the next level on the future of African culture and traditional medicine's contribution to contemporary day disease which is quite infectious, like the monkeypox, the hand virus, and how we are using our traditional medicine component to also contribute to vaccination. So it's been a wonderful time with you, Dr. Eluemuno Blyden, and also Dr. Ikechukwu Achebe, for your highly insightful contribution towards the origin of immunization and the African culture and traditional medicine. And I also want to draw the curtains here humbly that we'll come your way with another episode looking into the advanced phase of African culture and traditional medicine contributing to infectious diseases. So it's been great with you. My name is Ajiman Ochudako, and it's glad having you watch the COVID-19 special interview series, bringing you more knowledge and a good scope into the issue of immunization, COVID-19, and also bringing you the right infodemics for the future. It's been a nice day with you. Have a nice day, and bye.